To German commanders, Britain could now strike anywhere in the Reich with overwhelming force. Schnoffer fired again, expending most of his ammunition, and this time saw pieces of the Lancaster's fuselage breaking away. The bomber began losing altitude, and he radioed his ground controllers to report a confirmed kill. But the Lancaster didn't crash its pilot. Flying Officer Thomas Murphy managed to maintain control with 2 engines damaged and substantial structural damage. Murphy jettisoned the bomb load to reduce weight, nursing his crippled aircraft toward home. Against all probability, he made it back across the North Sea and crash-landed at an emergency airfield on the English coast. The Frankfurt raid demonstrated not just the Lancaster's impressive payload capacity, but also its remarkable ability to survive battle damage. German night fighters shot down 10 bombers that night, but over 180 aircraft successfully dropped their bombs on target and returned home, a loss rate of just 5%, far lower than early war bombing raids had suffered. Flight Lieutenant David Maltby piloted Lancaster AJJ, one of the reserve aircraft assigned to attack secondary targets. After the primary dams had been breached, he had practiced the low-level approach countless times over British reservoirs, flying at exactly 60 feet altitude and 240 miles per hour. To ensure the bomb would skip correctly across the water, the precision required was extraordinary. To high or to fast, and the bomb would shatter on impact. To low or to slow, and it would sink before reaching the dam wall. The devastation that followed stunned German authorities. 130 million gallons of water thundered down the Ruhr Valley, destroying factories, drowning livestock, flooding coal mines, and disrupting electrical power generation across Germany's most important industrial region. The Eder Dam breach, achieved later that same night, released another 60 million gallons. The economic damage exceeded that of dozens of CONVENTIONAL bombing raids. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in the West, received the damage reports with growing disbelief. How had British bombers delivered weapons capable of breaching dams that German engineers had designed to be virtually indestructible? The bouncing bomb concept seemed almost fantastical, yet the evidence was undeniable. The dams had been destroyed, and only the Lancaster bomber possessed the capacity to carry and deliver such specialized weapons. The psychological impact matched the physical destruction. Nazi propaganda had assured the German public that the Reich's defenses were impregnable, that British bombing represented a minor irritant rather than an existential threat. Now 2 of Germany's most important dams lay breached, and questions about what else British bombers might accomplish began circulating through both military and civilian populations. The myth of German invulnerability had been shattered as thoroughly as the concrete dam walls. The Lancaster's dominance in payload capacity continued evolving as the war progressed. By late 1943, modified Lancaster bombers carried the 12,000-pound Tallboy deep penetration bomb, designed to destroy hardened targets like submarine pens, railway tunnels, and underground factories. Then came the 22,000-pound Grand Slam, the largest conventional bomb used during the war, weighing more than 5 B-17 bombers could collectively carry. Squadron leader James Bazin piloted one of the specially modified Lancaster B Mark I specials. Capable of carrying the Grand Slam, these aircraft had their bomb bay doors removed, parts of the fuselage strengthened, and some defensive armament eliminated to save weight. Even with these modifications, carrying the massive bomb pushed the Lancaster to its absolute limits, requiring longer takeoff runs and careful attention to engine temperatures throughout the mission. The first Grand Slam mission on March 14, 1945, targeted the Bielefeld Railway Viaduct, a critical transportation link that conventional bombing had failed to destroy. Bazin approached the target at 18,000 feet, considerably higher than typical Lancaster bombing altitude, to give the massive bomb sufficient time to reach supersonic velocity and maximize its penetration capability. The bomb aimer, Pilot Officer Colin Cole, waited for the precise moment when wind conditions, aircraft speed, and target alignment converged perfectly. The Grand Slam plunged toward Earth, accelerating beyond the speed of sound and creating a supersonic shock wave that rattled windows miles away. It struck beside the viaduct and penetrated deep into the earth before detonating, creating an earthquake effect that collapsed a 100-foot section of the structure. German railway engineers examined the damage and declared the viaduct beyond repair. A single Lancaster bomber armed with one bomb had accomplished what entire squadrons with conventional weapons could not. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations Staff of the German Armed Forces High Command, reviewed intelligence reports about these super-heavy bombs with resignation bordering on despair. Germany had long since lost air superiority, and now British bombers could deliver individual weapons more powerful than entire bomb loads. From earlier in the war, the strategic bombing campaign had evolved into something far beyond what German planners had anticipated when they started the war. By contrast, American bomber development had taken a different path. The B-29 Superfortress, which entered service in 1944, could carry 20,000 pounds of bombs comparable to the Lancaster's maximum capacity. But B-29s operated primarily in the Pacific theater against Japan, while Lancasters continued dominating the strategic bombing campaign over Europe. The B-17, despite its iconic status, remained limited to roughly 4,000 pounds of ordnance throughout its service life. Wing Commander Leonard Cheshire, by now one of Bomber Command's most decorated pilots, reflected on how dramatically bombing capability had evolved. In 1940, British bombers struggled to deliver a few tons of bombs to targets in occupied France. By 1945, a single Lancaster could carry as much explosive power as an entire squadron had carried 5 years earlier, and deliver it with unprecedented accuracy using advanced targeting techniques like Cheshire's own low-level target marking methods. The Lancaster's production numbers reflected its importance to the British war effort. Between 1941 and 1946, over 7,300 Lancasters rolled off production lines, more than any other British heavy bomber and comparable to total B-17 production, despite Britain's smaller industrial base. The final irony of the Lancaster bomber story crystallized in the spring of 1945. As Allied forces advanced into Germany and captured detailed Luftwaffe intelligence files, British analysts discovered that German intelligence had continued underestimating Lancaster capabilities throughout the entire war, never fully grasping the aircraft's true potential until it was far too late to develop effective countermeasures. Major General Kenneth Strong, Eisenhower's chief intelligence officer, reviewed captured documents showing that even in 1944, with Germany's cities in ruins and industrial production collapsing under relentless bombing, Luftwaffe intelligence estimates of British bomber payload capacity remained significantly below reality. The Germans had believed what they wanted to believe, refusing to accept that British engineering had achieved something German aircraft designers had not: a heavy bomber that successfully balanced range, payload, and survivability. Flight Lieutenant William Reed, who had survived horrific injuries during a bombing mission and earned the Victoria Cross for bringing his damaged Lancaster home, visited Germany after the war and spoke with captured Luftwaffe officers. They expressed amazement when he described carrying 18,000 pounds of bombs on routine missions. One former night fighter pilot insisted Reed must be exaggerating, that such loads would make the aircraft too heavy to fly effectively. Reed simply showed him the official RAF operations manual documenting standard bomb loads evidence. The German officer found difficult to accept even in defeat. The statistical comparison told the story unambiguously. According to post-war analysis conducted by the Royal Air Force Historical Branch, Lancasters dropped approximately 608,000 tons of bombs during the war. Roughly two-thirds of the total tonnage dropped by all of RAF Bomber Command. No other aircraft, Allied or German, came close to matching this contribution to the strategic bombing campaign. Oberst Werner Baumbach, who commanded German bomber units and later wrote extensively about the air war, acknowledged in his post-war memoirs that Germany's failure to develop an equivalent heavy bomber represented one of the Luftwaffe's most critical strategic mistakes. While German industry produced excellent fighters and medium bombers, nothing in the Luftwaffe's inventory could match the Lancaster's combination of range, payload capacity, and operational flexibility. The B-17 comparison, while unfair in some respects given the different operational doctrines, remained stark. American doctrine prioritized daylight precision bombing with heavily armed aircraft, operating in mutual defense formations. British doctrine emphasized nighttime area bombing with lightly defended bombers, carrying maximum ordnance loads. Both approaches had their advocates, but the pure mathematics of destructive capacity favored the British method. A single Lancaster could deliver the explosive power of more than 5 B-17s. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, commander of RAF Bomber Command throughout most of the war, never wavered in his conviction that the Lancaster represented the most important aircraft in Britain's arsenal. He argued persuasively that without the Lancaster's enormous payload capacity, the strategic bombing campaign could not have inflicted the level of damage necessary to cripple German war production. Whether one agreed with Harris's controversial area bombing strategy or not, the Lancaster's technical superiority was undeniable. The 3 Nazi officers who first encountered Lancaster bombers, believing they were dealing with just another Allied aircraft, learned a devastating lesson that their entire military hierarchy would eventually share. Underestimating one's enemy is perhaps the most dangerous mistake in warfare. The Lancaster wasn't just another bomber, it was a revolutionary weapon system that redefined what strategic air power could accomplish. In the end, the Avro Lancaster dropped over 600,000 tons of bombs on Axis targets, participated in some of the war's most famous raids, and established payload records that wouldn't be exceeded until the jet age. The German assumption that British bombers were equivalent to, or inferior to their American counterparts, proved catastrophically wrong. While B-17s struggled to deliver 4,000 pounds to German targets, Lancasters routinely dropped 22,000 pounds with devastating effect, a 5-to-1 advantage that Nazi commanders recognized far too late to matter. The Lancaster had shown them exactly what the most successful heavy bomber of the European war could accomplish, and by the time German intelligence fully understood the truth, the war was already lost.
January 20th, 1953 dawned cold and gray over Washington, a chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of the capital city. On this morning, as crowds gathered along Pennsylvania Avenue to witness the peaceful transfer of power, 2 men sat in separate rooms, preparing for a ritual that would become anything but peaceful. Inside the White House, President Harry S. Truman dressed quietly, his jaw set with the same stubborn determination that had carried him through 7 years of impossible decisions. Just blocks away, at the Statler Hotel, President-elect Dwight David Eisenhower fastened his tie with military precision, his face a mask of controlled fury that few outside his inner circle would recognize. The relationship between these 2 men had not always been poisoned. Indeed, there was a time when Truman had considered Eisenhower not just an ally, but a potential successor of his own choosing. In 1945, when the general returned from Europe crowned with victory laurels, Truman had whispered to him at a reception that he would gladly help Eisenhower win the presidency, even running as his vice president if necessary. But that was before the political machinery ground their friendship to dust, before ambition and ideology drove a wedge so deep that on this inauguration morning, Eisenhower made a decision that would shock the nation. He would refuse to enter Truman's White House. The tradition was sacrosanct. Every incoming president since the earliest days of the Republic had begun Inauguration Day by calling upon his predecessor, at the Executive Mansion, sharing coffee or tea and riding together to the Capitol in a symbolic gesture of democratic continuity. But Eisenhower's limousine pulled up to the North Portico at precisely 11 o'clock that morning, and the general remained firmly seated in the back seat, his face turned away from the White House doors. Secret Service agents shifted uncomfortably. Aides exchanged worried glances. Inside, Truman waited, then understood, then flushed with an anger he would carry to his grave. According to contemporary accounts documented by historian David McCullough, whose extensive research into Truman's presidency provides crucial insight into this moment, the outgoing president finally emerged onto the portico alone, his expression thunderous. He descended the steps stiffly, climbed into the limousine beside Eisenhower, and the 2 men sat in glacial silence as the car rolled toward Capitol Hill. The crowds lining the route sensed something terribly wrong. their cheers faltering as they glimpsed the rigid profiles of both men staring straight ahead, never once acknowledging each other. What had brought them to this moment of profound public rupture? The answer lay not in a single incident but in a cascade of perceived betrayals, political calculations, and deeply personal wounds that had accumulated over the previous 2 years. The campaign of 1952 had been particularly vicious, with Eisenhower's refusal to defend former Secretary of State George Marshall Truman's close friend and Eisenhower's former commander from Senator Joseph McCarthy's reckless accusations serving as perhaps the most unforgivable sin in Truman's eyes. But even deeper currents ran beneath the surface, currents of class resentment, military versus civilian authority, and the fundamental question of what it meant to be an American leader in the atomic age. The limousine carried them through streets lined with Americans who had no idea they were witnessing history of an entirely different sort than they had anticipated. To understand how two men who had once shared mutual respect could descend into such bitter animosity, one must travel back to 1945, when the world still smoldered from the fires of the Second World War. General Dwight Eisenhower strode through the streets of European capitals as a conquering hero, the architect of Nazi Germany's defeat, while Harry Truman, thrust suddenly into the presidency by Franklin Roosevelt's death, struggled to fill shoes that seemed impossibly large. Their first meeting as president and general had been cordial, even warm, with Truman deeply impressed by Eisenhower's modesty and apparent lack of political ambition. Truman, who had never attended college and had failed at business before entering politics, found himself drawn to Eisenhower's apparent everyman quality despite his extraordinary achievements. The president saw in the general a rare combination: military brilliance without the dangerous political hunger that had toppled democracies throughout history. At a June 1945 victory celebration, Truman had made his extraordinary offer, telling Eisenhower he would support him for president in 1948 and even serve as his running mate. Eisenhower had demurred, insisting he had no political aspirations whatsoever, that he was a soldier who wished only to return to a quiet life once his service ended. For several years, this dynamic held steady. Eisenhower served as Army Chief of Staff, then accepted the presidency of Columbia University in 1948, seeming to confirm his disinterest in electoral politics. Meanwhile, Truman shocked the political establishment by winning the presidency in his own right that same year, defeating Thomas Dewey in what remains one of American history's greatest upsets. The president and the general maintained a friendly correspondence, exchanging letters on military policy and international affairs, with Truman continuing to seek Eisenhower's counsel on matters of national defense. The Korean War, which erupted in June 1950, began to shift the tectonic plates beneath their relationship. Truman's decision to commit American forces to defend South Korea proved deeply unpopular as the conflict dragged on, with casualties mounting and no clear victory in sight. The president's dismissal of General Douglas MacArthur in April 1951, though supported by military leadership including Eisenhower, unleashed a firestorm of public criticism. Truman's approval ratings plummeted to levels rarely seen in American presidential history, hovering near 23% by early 1952. Republican Party leaders, sensing opportunity, began courting Eisenhower with increasing intensity. The general, now serving as Supreme Commander of NATO forces in Europe, maintained his public stance of political neutrality, but private conversations revealed a growing concern about what he viewed as excessive government, spending and creeping socialism under democratic administrations. Letters from these years, preserved in the Eisenhower Presidential Library, show a man wrestling with duty to country versus personal preference, increasingly convinced that only his candidacy could prevent what he saw as fiscal catastrophe and weak foreign policy. The moment of transformation came in 1952, when Eisenhower finally declared his Republican affiliation and entered the presidential race. Truman felt betrayed on multiple levels. Not only had Eisenhower broken what Truman considered an implicit promise to stay out of politics, but he had joined the opposition party, the party of men Truman viewed as isolationists, who had opposed the very international engagement Eisenhower himself had championed. The personal became political, and the political became deeply personal in ways that would prove impossible to untangle. But nothing cut Truman deeper than Eisenhower's treatment of George Catlett Marshall, the man both president and general revered above all other living Americans. Marshall had served as Army Chief of Staff during World War II, as Secretary of State who developed the plan that saved post-war Europe, and as Secretary of Defense during the Korean War's darkest hours. He was, in Truman's estimation, the greatest American of the 20th century. Eisenhower owed his European command and subsequent fame directly to Marshall's selection and support. Yet Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin, riding high on his anti-communist crusade, had branded Marshall a traitor, part of a conspiracy so immense and an infamy so black as to dwarf any previous venture in the history of man. The moment of truth came in October 1952, when Eisenhower's campaign train rolled through Wisconsin, McCarthy's home state. The general's speechwriters had prepared remarks defending Marshall against McCarthy's slanders, paragraphs that praised Marshall's character and patriotism. As documented in journalist Evan Thomas's biography of Eisenhower, the general reviewed these passages aboard his campaign train, approved them, and prepared to deliver them at a major rally in Milwaukee. But McCarthy himself boarded the train, met with Eisenhower privately, and when the general took the podium that evening, the Marshall defense had been deleted entirely. Eisenhower stood beside McCarthy, smiling for cameras, the two men's hands clasped in apparent unity. Truman, watching newsreels of that rally, felt something break inside him. He had disagreed with Eisenhower's politics, resented his candidacy, and bristled at campaign attacks, but this was different. This was cowardice, a betrayal not just of Marshall but of the values Truman believed military men like Eisenhower were supposed to embody. The president began attacking Eisenhower personally in his own campaign speeches, supporting Democratic nominee Adlai Stevenson with unusual venom for an outgoing president. He called Eisenhower's military record into question, suggesting that others deserved more credit for winning the war. He mocked Eisenhower's intellect, claiming the general was being manipulated by cynical Republican operatives. He questioned Eisenhower's courage, the ultimate insult from one who had served in combat to one whose military reputation was unassailable. Eisenhower's response was equally personal. He stopped referring to Truman as President Truman or the President, using only Truman or the administration, with a disdain that dripped from every syllable. He blamed Truman personally for every American casualty in Korea, implying that the president's incompetence was killing American boys. He suggested that corruption in Truman's administration reached into the Oval Office itself, though carefully avoiding explicit accusations that might invite libel suits. The two men, who had once corresponded as friends, now communicated only through increasingly bitter public statements. The election itself was a landslide, with Eisenhower capturing 42 of 48 states and winning the popular vote by nearly 7 million ballots. Truman watched the returns come in at his home in Independence, Missouri, surrounded by loyalists but feeling utterly rejected by the American people he had served through crisis after crisis. The next morning, duty required that he telegraph congratulations to President-elect Eisenhower and begin the transition process. But every word of courtesy cost him dearly. The first face-to-face meeting came on November 5th, just 2 days after the election, when protocol demanded that Eisenhower visit the White House for an initial transition discussion. Truman, determined to maintain presidential dignity despite his personal feelings, prepared thoroughly for the meeting, assembling briefing books on everything from ongoing military operations to sensitive intelligence matters. He arranged for key cabinet officials and military leaders to be available for consultations. He even ordered the White House kitchen to prepare Eisenhower's favorite foods, a gesture of hospitality that cost him considerable pride given his bitter feelings. Eisenhower arrived exactly on time, his military punctuality in full evidence, but his demeanor was arctic. According to accounts preserved in the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library, the meeting lasted barely 2 hours, far shorter than traditional transition consultations. The president-elect showed minimal interest in the detailed briefings Truman's staff had prepared, asking few questions and volunteering almost nothing about his own plans or policy intentions. When Truman tried to engage him in substantive discussions about Korea, Soviet intentions, or domestic policy challenges, Eisenhower responded with platitudes or simply deferred, saying his team would handle such matters after the inauguration. One exchange particularly galled Truman. The president explained the reasoning behind several controversial decisions: the firing of MacArthur, the decision to fight in Korea, the approach to negotiations with the Soviets, seeking not approval, but at least understanding from his successor. Eisenhower listened impassively, then responded that he preferred to make his own judgments without being influenced by the previous administration's thinking. Truman, veteran of countless tough negotiations, recognized the response for what it was: a deliberate insult, suggesting that nothing the current administration had done or learned was worth considering. The president's face flushed, but he maintained his composure, curtly ending the meeting earlier than scheduled. Subsequent interactions grew even more strained. When Truman invited Eisenhower to attend National Security Council meetings during the transition to understand ongoing operations and decision-making processes, the president-elect declined, sending representatives instead. When Truman offered to arrange detailed briefings on the most sensitive intelligence matters, including atomic weapons capabilities, covert operations, and assessments of Soviet leadership, Eisenhower agreed only to minimal briefings, preferring to receive information through his own incoming team rather than from Truman's people. The message was clear: the incoming administration viewed the outgoing one as not just wrong on policy, but as fundamentally tainted, its information and advice suspect by association. The Eisenhower team's behavior toward Truman's staff proved even more dismissive. Incoming officials treated their outgoing counterparts with a coldness that violated every tradition of professional courtesy in government service. Requests for information were met with delays or outright refusals. Attempts to explain ongoing programs and policies were cut short or ignored entirely. Career civil servants found themselves caught in the middle, unsure whether to respond to requests from the incoming team that seemed designed to circumvent or undermine the outgoing president's authority. The atmosphere grew so toxic that several senior Truman advisors complained directly to the president, asking permission to refuse cooperation altogether, though Truman insisted they maintain professional standards even if Eisenhower's people would not. Behind closed doors, Truman raged. He understood political differences and expected partisan attacks, but this wholesale rejection of institutional continuity struck him as dangerous to national security and contemptuous of the presidency itself. In private conversations recorded by his staff, Truman used language about Eisenhower that would have shocked Americans who knew him only through his public persona. He questioned Eisenhower's intelligence, his character, and his fitness for office, predictions that the general would prove a disaster as president, manipulated by smarter men with dangerous ideologies. Of all the grievances that accumulated between Truman and Eisenhower during the campaign and transition, none cut deeper or proved more irreparable than the matter of George Marshall. To understand the intensity of Truman's fury required understanding what Marshall meant to him, not just as a public figure, but as a personal ideal, the embodiment of everything Truman believed a great American should be. Marshall had shown Truman, a man without college education or elite credentials, the same respect he showed everyone, judging by character and competence rather than pedigree. When Truman had faced the impossible decision about using atomic weapons against Japan, Marshall had offered clear military counsel without political.